All right. Welcome, Jonah. Welcome, everyone listening.
Thank you.
It's really great to have you here. And just a reminder and recap for anyone following this podcast. This is Honest AI, where I speak about AI, but not necessarily just AI. I cover broader the technology trends, and I do it with honesty. So I like speaking about the technology without the hype. And for that purpose, I invite people who have very interesting backgrounds from various, let's say, walks of life. And I have a strong preference for people with multidisciplinary backgrounds, not just tech. And speaking of that, I want to introduce to everyone our guest, Jonah Lynch. Since childhood, Jonah pursued the Renaissance ideal, competence in many fields, endless curiosity. He began his search for knowledge as a physics student at McGill University, and then broadened into humanistic interests, including studies in philosophy, a doctorate in theology, service as a priest, and second PhD in artificial intelligence applied to ancient history. His thesis was entitled Method and Intelligence, Digital Approaches to Memory and Communication in Historiography. He resides in Italy and divides his time between scientific research, consulting, and teaching. Thank you again, Jonah. So I ask if you can just cover anything else that I didn't cover in your brief introduction.
Well, I'm not sure where to begin. I guess I'm a bit of a wanderer, intellectually and physically even. But yeah, let's just get started with the conversation. I'm sure I'll tell some stories along the way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would like to start from this origin and the path that brought you to AI, which is, let's say, different than traditionally people who came from computer science. What was your path? What was your interest and passions that led you to the field, and what work you're doing in this field today?
Well, actually, I've been interested in computers since I was a very small kid. I remember I must have been 5 or 6 years old when one of the first personal computers was available in a local store. My father brought me to look in the window. We didn't have the money for a computer at that time, but I was absolutely fascinated by the machine. And I began to have this desire, someday I'll have a computer. And a few years later, my dad was working on building our house, and he had discovered this wonderful material, a vapor barrier that you put around the house to make sure that it keeps all the water out. And he was surprised and impressed by this material because they told him it couldn't be ripped. So he brought a sample home to me and he said, if you can tear this substance, this material, I will get you a computer. Now, I think I had superhuman strength at that moment because I actually did tear the unterrible material. So my dad, who wasn't a rich man at that time, turned red, but he kept his word. He found a way to, my uncle worked at Bell Labs, and so they sent us a TI 994A, one of the early personal computers, and I learned to program. I was 7 years old. So I've been into computers since that age, and then I worked in Pascal and then C and C++ in high school and then some Fortran in college in my physics degree. And then, yes, then I went toward totally different fields, philosophy, theology, but I always retain an interest in technology. And then if you ask me, what about AI? I would say AI is kind of like experimental philosophy in the sense that some ideas that we've been playing with without being able to test them really for thousands of years are now testable. It's now possible to run experiments on some linguistic and philosophical ideas. So that I find very attractive. And also philosophical and religious interests, I think, intersect with the experience of the oracle, the desire for somebody to tell you what to do, who to be. And AI also has this aspect pretty strongly too, where there's the sense of at least the impression, the appearance of speaking to an omniscient being. So those are a couple of reasons why.
Very interesting path. And building on this, I'm curious to learn what do you think these paths and the different angles where you approach the field, but also what else you learn that doesn't have anything to do with the field along those lines and along these experiences. What did they, let's say, teach you about your current work in AI that you feel you have some more insight or some more knowledge respect to some more traditional paths like engineering?
I don't know if I have more knowledge. I think that's more of a sort of case by case, person by person question. What I have done in my life has been motivated in great part by what Richard Feynman said toward the end of his life. He said, I think he wrote it on his blackboard or something in the room that he has his last office. It said, know how to solve every problem that has been solved. And now I'm far short of that. ability, but I have sort of always had this idea that I want to know everything that has already been discovered. And in some sense, that knowing everything that already exists is the precondition for being able to make a new discovery. And so I've also learned along the way that it's not at all easy to know, even in a small field, everything that has already been solved, know how to solve every problem that has been solved. And if that's the precondition to doing original work, there isn't much original work. So that might just be the case, right? That might just be the way it is. But I think that the desire to explore the fields as well as the highways, to spread across all of the space, is one of the major features of my life, my personality, and the way that I've approached learning. Now, covering the surface, spreading over the surface a mile wide, an inch deep, is one way of approaching things, approaching knowledge. It also turns out that going deep down, straight down, like in any question, you end up asking similar questions at the end. There are vertical roads of specialization that tend to meet in some way. I haven't really followed that road in my life. And so I think that there are highly qualified, highly competent people who have spent all their time doing a few things, who know as much or more than me about all of the rest too. There are people like, I don't know, Joshua Bach comes to mind as a person who's incredibly competent in his approach to many details, and he has also gone straight down and, highly qualified research. So I don't know if I have more to bring to the table, but what I do have to bring to the table is a kind of endless curiosity and a desire to insert whatever new things I can do inside of the existing, like to expand the existing domain, I guess is what I would say. I'd like to push the edges out.
That's incredibly fascinating. I love the approach, and resonates a lot with my personal path as well. I'm curious to get deeper in some of the activities that you're involved with. I'm aware you're teaching or doing research. You're also working on some consulting projects. I'm curious, let's cover a bit everything, starting from teaching. What do you teach, to who?
Okay, so I mean, at this current moment, I'm not teaching. I taught up through about 6 months ago at the University of Milan, Icocca. I was teaching statistics to social sciences master's students. So how to run statistical experiments and measures using the R language. That's a course I've taught both to social sciences and to business students in various places in Milan. I like teaching. I like trying to explain things and try to find the road into the heart of a student. But I also find, I mean, I've taught a bunch of different places, high schools and universities, and I find that the best rhythm for me is like to teach a semester and then to not teach for a while, so that I can actually go deeper into things myself and then have more to say. That's what I've done so far. One project I'm working on now is about teaching AI to elementary and middle school students. And the premise that I'm starting with is that it's important to get inside the black box and try to understand as much as possible without the extra complications of this magical machine that looks like an oracle doing things that you can't understand. Actually, a lot of the operations that we call AI are pretty simple. They have to do with rules, they have to do with linear regression, looking for patterns and predicting the future based on past patterns. And a lot of that can be taught at a fairly easy level without using computers, just using different experiences. Like, for example, helping somebody blindfolded pass through a maze by hand is easy enough. But then if you try to abstract it and say, okay, give a set of rules so that a person who's blindfolded can get through the maze, then you start to think at a meta level, which is a lot like what you're doing in the first iteration of a self-driving car. This is a project that I'm presenting in a United States school district in a couple of weeks. Then I'll be talking about it at a university in Slovenia that's invited me to talk about this. And so there's some teaching I'm doing there too, but more on a kind of spot basis, trying to think about how to help students today navigate the coming AI world to the degree that it will be AI. I think there are a lot of things that aren't going to change too.
Yeah, very interesting. I want to make a quick digression there because I'm both excited and concerned about the role of AI in education. So I just wonder what's your take? What's good and what we should be cautious about using
Yeah,
AI in the context of education.
I guess I think about it a lot in the terms of like a muscle, that if you don't use muscles, they atrophy. Now, if you use force multiplying machines, you can do a lot of things you can't do with muscles. And I don't think that as humans, I don't think we're nostalgic for the time when enormous groups of slaves would dig ditches and build foundations for buildings. I think we're glad that we have bulldozers that can do those things. But there's also something to be said for maintaining the full strength of the human and choosing our priorities carefully. So I think that education has a lot to do with those priorities. It has to do with which kinds of things do we want to simplify and which kinds of things are better kept local, are better kept on our local machine instead of outsourced to somewhere else. Writing is a great example of that, right? So, before writing, humans had incredible memories, and oral cultures are able to memorize enormous amounts of text and myth and story and history. We have the same architecture, and we've chosen to outsource a lot of that computational power to the written word. So that has given us certain advantages, which are undoubted, unquestionable, but it's also given us certain disadvantages. And we've made that choice. We've said, okay, this is a trade-off that we're willing to make. With AI, I guess we're probably talking about large language models today in 2025 when we say AI, but there are other things we could be meaning as well. With automated decision-making systems or with large collections of text in a large language model, that trade-off is not yet quite as clear. So we're currently navigating what is important for the future and what are we choosing to make not important. We're probably not getting that entirely right yet. So I think there's a lot of reflection that needs to happen in this stage. I'm also pretty hopeful. 10 years ago, I wrote a book about technology and human relationships in which I was pretty concerned. I was pretty concerned about it called The Scent of Lemons. And I was pretty concerned about the effect that social media would have on our ability to connect with each other. But I have to say, 10 years on, I think we have learned to a large degree how to do it well. And we're at least conscious of the trade-off. So maybe you get sad and FOMO because you look at Instagram too much, but we know that that's happening. And that sort of meta consciousness is helpful as we navigate it further and decide, what persons do we want to be. So I think education has a really important role to play there, but also part of it is just running into walls and finding out that it hurts.
Yeah, that's right. And speaking of hurting and fatigue, there's also a pedagogical, say, value of hardship and doing the hard work rather than taking shortcuts. That I think it's another good value to educate.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. But I have to laugh a little bit because I totally remember when I discovered that with a calculator, I think it was in the fourth grade, that with a calculator, I could do my, my math homework much more quickly. And by doing it more quickly with a calculator, I became dumber. And there's new research came out of the Wharton School last year that said basically the same thing. Students who use AI on their homework do better as long as they've got AI. As soon as they stop using AI, the people who didn't use it before do better. So, is this crutch good for you, like for what you need in your life? It's an open question, but it's an important one.
Yeah, that's right. Great. And moving to the research work that you've done and that, if I understand well, shaped some of your thinking along or the thinking that brought you to a technology or a product that you're building. I would like to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so the question of what is true, I guess, has always intrigued, delighted, infuriated, attracted. It's a question that I care about a lot. What is real? People have told me, stop saying what is true because, that word is passé. We don't, but I don't know. I think it's the best word we've got. It's not perfect, but words are approximate references, I guess. Anyway, so truth is something I care about, and that's brought me to study a lot of different things. When I studied physics, I really also wanted to know what came before the Big Bang and what's going to happen after, that kind of thing. So that broadens out into philosophy and then theology and so forth. Then at another point, I felt like the whole edifice of humanistic research, especially in philosophy and theology, was something like an inverted pyramid where there's an enormously beautiful flowering of ideas on a certain level. And then as you come down, it's all resting on smaller and smaller pillars. And then at the very point, the bottom point, what is it resting on is a question that I think I arrived at several times in my life. But the last time that I arrived to that point, I said, okay, right now I don't know. And right now I'm also not particularly interested in pursuing that path because I really like something solid. I guess somebody called me Cartesian the other day, and I think maybe that is what happened to me, that I ended up wanting some kind of trustworthy foundation, and I went to math. Math was the place where I thought I could find something more trustworthy. Now, it's very poor in a sense. Math can't say much, but what it says, it's very certain about. I appreciate that. So that's part of my story. Then the next part of it, which is the research I did in my second doctorate when I was working with a group of historians and archaeologists, was about, okay, so I was trying to model their discourse, model how do archaeologists argue about their interpretation of history. And I tried to build software that would help us to remember the arguments and create a weighted graph where the arguments that each person brought to bear would be connected to source data. So basically, like not open to opinion data, sort of not open to opinion, right? And then through successive levels of abstraction and interpretation, get to the level of an overall discourse where you've got an interpretation of information of all the pieces of pottery coming out of the ground. I was also modeling, the various levels of authority of the people speaking, and I was trying to build a graph structure so that you could get back to the original disagreement, because you often have situations where schools of thought disagree on many things, but if you can get a bird's eye view of their disagreement, you realize that what they really disagree on is somewhere upstream. And one reason why I was doing this was as a way to help new researchers who were being onboarded into our team to get up to speed quickly, so that they could quickly learn, where did our team take a stand? Why did we take that stand, and who thought differently? So that was sort of a first version of things. And then as I did that, I realized that, text vectorization could be useful. A lot of NLP things that had been developed in the previous years would be useful in what I was building. So I started to learn a lot about NLP and the AI techniques that were coming out. This is in 2020, 2021. Then when ChatGPT hit the big time in 2022, I was well prepared for that, and it was a very exciting moment for me when I realized that the convergence of linguistics and structures of knowledge and graph theory and algebraic topology and a bunch of different ways of thinking about the structure of information converged for me. And that was the research that I did for my doctorate, which is publicly, it's been published, so that's available. After that, I saw some ways, I was thinking, how could this be useful for more people? Because archaeology, first of all, the archaeologists generally didn't understand or care what I was doing very much, because it was kind of too mathy. They're used to arguing things out, and that's the way that they like to do it.
Yeah.
They don't all have a Cartesian bent like me. So then I started to think, where else could this sort of process be useful? And the idea that I've developed since then is now part of what I'm calling Innovation Lens, which is it's a basically topic agnostic tool to help scientists think about what's the next step in their specific domain. So it's based on those same structures and ideas that I was doing in my doctorate, but it's also forward-looking. I found a, say we because it makes it sound more broad, but I guess it was just me. Anyway, I found a pattern in the distribution of articles and the way that scientists talk about their work, which has some predictive value. So I've started to show how that can be useful in predicting what's a good next article subject or a good next problem statement for research in some given domain.
That's super interesting. So I understand you're building a tool to let's say help a researcher to generate hypotheses or generate areas of research that have not been explored yet. Would that be like an accurate description?
Yeah. So, well, I guess what I can, building on my previous statement that I want to believe in math, um, I believe in the statistical validation. So here's how I did it. One was, first of all, what am I looking for? So the target is I'm looking for articles that receive more than 1,000 citations. That's a pretty good article, right? You could say that 1,000 citation articles, they tend to be the articles that start something. They're the ones that the obligatory reference in every paper after that in some domain. How did I validate? I thought, okay, so how do young researchers decide what to write about? Generally, they choose something that's within the existing literature. So you can try to look at a field, and then you look for a little gap in the literature, and that's where you go. Something missing, but within a domain that's already been explored. Now I can quantify that because I can translate, this is something that word vectorization allows us to do. We can translate words into a geometric space. So I can translate a scientific domain into a geometric space and say, okay, how many of given a distribution, so given an existing collection of articles in this space, in the future, how many thousand and up citation articles are found in that same domain, right? So that's a test you can do. So I did that, and I compared that against my algorithm, my thing that I discovered, the pattern I discovered. So that's one baseline. Another baseline would be go random, cover the whole space, cover the whole domain. You've got basically unlimited resources, study everything, and now if you study everything, of course, you're going to beat my algorithm, but you don't have unlimited resources. So I was also able to show that in that case, my algorithm beats the scattershot way of proceeding up until like a high number of test points. That validation tells me that okay, so there is an intermediate distance. Like if you just sort of go randomly looking, use the archaeologist metaphor. If you just go dig somewhere randomly, you might find an Egyptian tomb filled with gold. It's not very likely, but it is possible. If you go where the known pyramids are and dig, you're likely to find an empty tomb because somebody else has been there before you. So is there an intermediate distance where the information from the past is predictive, but is also new, right? So it's not randomly just digging, but it's going the right distance away from the existing objects. So it's a metaphor, but that is kind of how the system works. It measures a distance and a location, and based on that location, it says dig here, and you're more likely to find gold.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. And we hear these days a lot about tools that other companies are launching to do research. One was the AI scientist by Sakana. We have heard all the labs launching their version of deep research. Can you explain, like, I think I can guess what's the difference between the tool you're building and these kind of tools. But can you explain better how, like how the tool works in relationship with those others and what's the role of the researcher? I think there is a difference between the role of the researcher in one and the other
Yeah,
approach.
absolutely, absolutely. No, that's a good comparison. You're making me think I need to update my white paper and take into account some other things. So, what can a large language model do, even with iterated prompting like the deep research or R1? The various ways that they do. What can that do? As compared with a human researcher. And the way that I understand it is mostly having to do with in-domain or in distribution and out of distribution inference. So if the information is already there, the LLM is a wonderful librarian. I mean, you can retrieve information that would have been very hard to find in a very short amount of time. It's really wonderful from lots of points of view. But how is that actually going to do something that's new? So maybe it's doing the kind of research that middle and low level PhD students are doing, where they're really just filling small gaps, and everybody knows it, and that's fine. It is useful. Sort of like compiling tables of logarithms. It's just awful. But before you have calculators, you need them. So fine, you do it. Now that's one kind of work, right? That's a kind of work that I think could be automated with the current systems on LLMs, and that's fine. What a creative researcher does is pull from different fields or different times, or have intuitions that have a mathematical basis and then they're expressed in some other field where you didn't expect them. Like quantum physics is full of this, where you have mathematical intuitions that precede by decades or hundreds of years their physical interpretation in the quantum world. That's very beautiful and very wonderful that somebody who happened to know that math was able to then solve the physical problem at a later time when it was possible to understand there was a problem and do the physical experimentation to validate it. That's a different thing, and a large language model is not able to do that right now. So what am I doing? What I'm trying to do is a little bit different from both of those paradigms. One thing I'm trying to do is, first of all, I did find a pattern, I measured it, it's visible, so that's the basis. What's the pattern good for? Well, since the data I've been working on so far is scientific articles, it's good for helping scientists prioritize which topics to study and which ones to kind of say, it's all right, we'll leave that one for now. Hypothesis generation, because then there's a next step, right? Finding being able to tell the scholar where to dig is useful, but that abstract space is not where we work and live. So you have to also translate that abstract space into words. And that's where my generative AI part is coming in. But it's, again, not working in the same way as things like Sakana or DeepSeek, Deep Search, because what I'm doing is I'm literally translating the vector into words. I'm not prompting a model using words to give me more words. That's a fundamental difference.
And so how researchers in different fields would use this to start off and accelerate their work if you can bring it to life?
Yeah, so the demo is online. It's already sort of working. We're trying to improve the front end because there are lots of technical difficulties when you're handling millions of articles and trying to turn it into a responsive web app. But whatever, that's just the surface level stuff. I think that the way that it's useful is for scientists who are looking to decide what is their next study. What's their next topic? To generate a list of tens or hundreds of hypotheses within their domain, right? So part of the thing is, like, take computer science. There are literally 100,000 computer science articles published every year just on arXiv. So you can't read it. It's not possible. Now you can say, okay, well, I know about large language models, so I can narrow it down, and then I'm really mostly about whatever transformer architectures, and so that's my specialty. That's one way of thinking about things. But a lot of times the new discoveries are made on the boundary between fields, where one field is well defined, another field is well defined, but at the boundary something happens, something is new, and there a new field is born. So one thing that my tool can do is help you to pay attention to those boundary layers in an extremely updated way. So you don't need to read 100,000 articles and remember them, which is also impossible. But you can use a tool that every week is updated with all the recent arXiv articles and graphically see where's the boundary, and then zoom in on the boundary that's most interesting to you, and then automatically generate hypotheses there. So now, if you throw away 95% of the hypotheses, I would say that's fine. I mean, I don't expect all of them or even many of them to be useful. But if you find two or three that are good, that spark an idea that you didn't have before, that I think is the power of the latent space inside the large language models, where concepts from the past, right, so it's in distribution, have never been juxtaposed in this way, this particular way. And that juxtaposition can bring the researcher to have an original thought and say, if I go down this direction, I bet I can make something that actually makes progress. Now, this is my hypothesis, but we are in the stage of validation. So I'm inviting scholars to use it and giving away free coupons to do so. And I'd love to have feedback about that, to understand which domains is it useful and which is it not, because I don't expect it to be useful everywhere. My validation was done on computer science articles. So I know that it does work there. Then for everything else, I still need to do the validation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna share with these recordings the links to try out the tool.
Awesome.
My next question was exactly on the field, but you kind of already answered. Like, you envision this tool to be used in any field virtually.
I mean, okay, so first I did it for computer science because I thought that's where the money is, that's where the interest is today. So that was my Silicon Valley startup dream. That's where I started. Then I thought, well, why not all of arXiv? And once you've got it set for this kind of article, why don't you just take everything else too? And so 6 subjects then. Computer science, biology, okay, so biology, economics or quantitative finance, and electrical engineering, signal processing are very small fields, but I've distinguished them as 3 distinct fields. The big ones on arXiv are computer science, physics, and math. And so that's already, that's interesting. But then I had somebody say, what about medical? I'd really like to try this out for pharmaceuticals or for health innovation, health tech. So I also have loaded up all of PubMed, which is, a lot, 27 million articles. And why these 2 archives? Well, because they're free and they have good APIs, so it's easy to download. But I think that the basic underlying procedure could be applied to many other fields too. And I think from a commercialization point of view, that's actually where the money is going to be, is not so much serving individual scientists, but finding like pharmaceutical industry, or maybe it's insurance or hedge funds or something, I think that'll be more interesting in the long term, and I would love for that to be the way for the scientist-facing tool to be free. That's kind of what I'm hoping to do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's wonderful. Developing and using the tool yourself. Have you already had some sort of eureka or aha moment where you saw something on these boundaries that you were describing that actually is really interesting? And
That's a good question. I don't have an example I can point to right now. This is what I've started to do with specialists in a couple of fields, but I've just started. So I'm going to keep that question open, and I would like to come back in a couple of months and tell you, okay, I've made these 2 or 3 discoveries that seem really interesting, and talk again.
I'm gonna try myself and
Yeah,
let you know what
cool.
to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And can you describe a bit better the training data that you use to build this tool? And I want to ask you this question on two directions. So one is to understand the type of training that you've done and what are the implications on training on those data. And on the other one, with training data comes also sorts of some biases or risks of topic clumpings, these kind of things, whether you've considered that.
Sure. So the training data is the archive. So
Yeah. Okay.
now I have to qualify that because parts of the system are trained in certain different ways, but the essential architecture is that the data is the scientific articles. In the first iteration, the data is the title and the abstract of the scientific articles. Just a computational problem, but it can certainly be expanded to include the full text and the images and so forth. But so that's the basic data of the system. Then it goes through a couple of different transformations. One is using a language model which is specialized on scientific articles. So there's a layer of modeling which is fine-tuned for the kinds of text that scientific articles contain, and also their citation networks, the bibliographic, the graph of connections between articles and people. So that's one part that's important. Then there's another part which is how are the embeddings of the articles manipulated in latent space? That's purely mathematical, so it's not open to question of bias. And then the final stage, well, I guess two pieces to the final stage. One stage is translating the abstract vector into text again, so reverse engineering the vector, which is done through an iterative process where you try what might be the text for that vector, embed that text, measure it against the original vector, and use the difference as a way to get closer. And so after some number of iterations, you arrive at a text which closely corresponds, the embedding of which closely corresponds to your original vector. That stage it works pretty well. It's also probably the most open to optimizations and improvements. And then the final stage is a very basic prompting layer in 2 steps using a publicly available commercial LLM, where I literally say, take this text and make it in complete sentences. Like that's it. I don't add anything, don't take anything away. But sometimes the text that comes out of the reverse engineering the vector is a text that is truncated or expresses an incomplete thought. So just to clean it up for the user. This is something like, I think in version 2, I'd like to offer the option. Would you like to see the raw output or would you like to see the prettified output? Because I think that as a customer-facing product, you have to give kind of pretty output. So it makes sense to say, turn it into complete sentences. But I also think that the raw information is probably more useful in the real case. I don't want to push scientists away because they have ugly answers, but I also don't want to push them away because the information is too pretty and not useful. Because we are becoming,
Excellent.
we're becoming like suspicious of LLM bullshit.
Yeah.
It's too prevalent, And then the
Yeah.
final
Human
stage.
intelligence has a better detector.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, then the final stage is again a prompt to a commercial LLM, but it's just doing ranking. It's just saying, does this text look valuable or not? Score it between 0 and 10. And I use that to try to give the best things first to the user. So that's the overall architecture.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. And speaking of let's say some ethical and societal angles of this product. So have you thought or put in place already any safeguards to ensure the tool doesn't generate unethical research directions, harmful directions, stuff like that?
No, I haven't. I don't think I want to either. I think that yeah, the way I think about research is that it is basically infinite field, and there are domains where yeah, it's even hard to say where you shouldn't go, where you don't want to go, where we have discovered it's not worth going. There are different ways to describe why would you not study a subject. But I think I would rather leave that possibility open and not outsource the moral decision to a machine, but let the human decide. Because what I'm trying to do is spark thoughts. You're going to throw away 95% of the thoughts sparked by my tool for sure, right? For sure. Those 5% that you keep, it's up to you which they are. And I don't think I really want to hide ideas that might be unsavory. I think I'd rather leave it up to humans. I don't know. What do you think?
Like that, yeah, I was thinking, I like that I like the ethos that I also think differentiated this approach with the completely automated deep research or Sakana AI scientist agent, where you offload everything to the machine. So the scientist is no longer on the driver's seat. It's more like, do this for me.
They're just
So
peer
at that
reviewing the
point,
results.
exactly. So I think it not only becomes dehumanizing, but I already see myself the way I use this tool. I become lazy. So I would become lazy to review entire papers generated completely by an agent. Whereas this approach of first redefining a hypothesis and a research question that is still the job of the human researcher and giving the tool just to do that better, faster, and in a non-obvious way is already very valuable. And I like this, let's say, bias towards the human agency and human responsibility and free will rather than putting constraints into the machine. Then the debate becomes like who put that constraints and why. And
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's inevitable because how else? I mean, we've been debating this for as long as humans have been around. You know, who says what's good and right and true? And we know that it's a very important question. And at the same time, we know that there isn't an easy answer to it. And you can't like the whole idea that you can put guardrails in place is begging all of the relevant questions. You know, how do you know that those are the right guardrails? And I'm not saying that as a you know, as a sophomoric way of just getting out of the argument, but to say that is really the relevant question. How do you know? How do you know? And I guess I don't want to make a universal judgment by saying this. Like, I don't think that everybody has to live the way that I have lived, but I would say that I have had to run my head into the wall a few times, you know, and discover that it hurt. I don't think I
yeah,
could have learned certain things in another way. And in any case, I didn't. So that makes me say, I would rather a world where I'm not too protected from the walls so that I can actually find where they are and not stop short of them because somebody told me, but there wasn't actually a wall there. And then yes, I bear the wounds of that too, and I'm not proud and not happy to bear trauma, but I don't know if there's another way to get through life than bearing a couple of
it
scratches.
reminds me a lot that long essay that Jonathan Haidt wrote a few years ago on the Atlantic, The Cuddling of the American Mind.
Yeah,
I don't know if you came
yeah, yeah,
across
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah, very interesting. And if I can, there was a question that it's a bit probably off on another tangent, but it's maybe relevant. The I was reading the technical description of how you tested this, and so I understand that you have, this training data creates your, let's say, mathematical space, your geometrical space of topics, directions, etc. And we were discussing. The what I believe the test data is, you took out some of the, let's say, top cited papers and try to predict whether your, let's say, your tool predictions were close enough to the point in the space where those top papers reside. And now my question is, if the space, if the geometry and the mathematics of that space is created by the training data, isn't that a risk that we are missing something because it's not just part of the definition of that geometry? Not sure if the question is clear.
Well, specify it further if you want, or I'll respond as it is.
Yeah, so I think that the choice of the training data influence the space that we look because we can only move in a space that has been defined by that training data.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
given that the training data, let's say, doesn't have tomorrow's discoveries, doesn't that limit the geometry where we can explore?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. This is, yeah, I'm smiling because this is the thing that I was trying to study most specifically in my doctorate with the image of, you know, bootstrapping where you're like literally lifting yourself out of the bog by your hair, you know, which is not possible, right? But in a sense it is possible, and it's exactly the history of human thought. Like we started out on the steppes of Africa not that long ago, 60,000 years ago, something like that. I mean, even if you want to go back to like the skulls that they found in Dmanisi, Georgia 2 million years ago, or whatever beginning point you want to put, it's not been that long that humans have been around. And everything, all of our cultural artifacts have been produced in a really short length of time. And as far as I can tell, there weren't any angels that came to tell us how to invent language or how to domesticate fire or animals or how to extract iron out of stones or how to use yeast or how to turn clay into an instrument of writing. And all of these things that we have discovered, and now here we are. You're in Australia, and I'm about as far away as you can get on the globe. And we're talking in real time across a video connection. And 20 years ago, that was science fiction, essentially, and here it is. So we have expanded the latent space of the model by bootstrapping our way into new dimensions and new spaces. So first of all, that's to say somehow humans are able to expand the latent space. And then another question is, are we expanding the latent space or are we exploring it? And so are we finding things that were already there? And this brings us back to Socrates, the idea that the ideas already exist somehow and we discover them rather than create them. Anyway, really interesting questions. But where that brings me is to say, okay, if we're talking about the latent space of a large language model that has been trained on a certain kind of data, what does that say about the conclusions that can be reached? What I think it says is there is information in the specific contents of that space, for sure. So you query the certain vector, you get out the text, the original text that trained it, or the original concepts that trained it. Okay, that's clear. What else is there? Well, I think there is some geometry beyond that. There is some clustering and some distance metrics that can be used inside of that latent space that are interesting. So we have concepts like concept vectors, where you can add a scalar to all of the vectors in some dimension and move things toward Claude always thinking about the Golden Gate Bridge. I don't know if you remember that wonderful experiment that Anthropic did last year. So concept vectors, okay, that's another level. What I'm saying is I guess this is a hypothesis, right? This is something that needs to be further clarified and validated. But I think it's verosimile, it looks like it's true that novel location in latent space does have some content. Novel meaning there isn't any vector in the training data that points to that location. It does have some content which you can deduce by its clustering, by what it's close to. And then my tool is kind of just basically saying, okay, so just take the juxtaposition of those concepts from that cluster, and sometimes you get out interesting information.
Really cool. Yeah, it's very exciting. Speaking of which, what was the most exciting part to developing?
I should go find out what day it was exactly, but it was something like October 2nd. 2024. I've been working on this thing for 5 years, and I had this idea, and there are lots of steps to learning enough Python to be able to actually program it, and learning enough about how to manage multi-gigabyte or terabytes of data, and all that, all the plumbing. When you finally get all the tubes together, actually hitting run, okay, so do my test, validate this. Does it actually work? After 5 years of trying to make it work, I was really scared. I thought, nobody's going to know. I'm here in my room alone, but I'm going to know. And I've just either spent or wasted a good chunk of time. And, for a couple hours, I was going back and forth, and I wasn't hitting run. I was waiting, and then I thought, you know what? I want to know. Is it real? Is this idea actually real? And so off we go. And I ran it, and it didn't work. It was like null hypothesis. It's like, oh man, this is terrible. So I thought, okay, well, let's do a grid search and along the parameters and see if maybe I just was really unlucky and chose the wrong parameter right away. And that is what happened. I did a simple search, and I found that basically all the other parameters gave some result except for the one that I used at the start. Then I started to drill in and do the comparisons against randomness, against the existing distribution and so forth. And I was jumping, like jumping up and down. Yeah, that was an exciting moment. I was so happy that, it worked. So that was the eureka moment.
Fantastic. If the innovation lens could generate a hypothesis about any unsolved problem in science, what would you want it to tackle?
I mean, the Riemann hypothesis or quantum gravity, or, I don't have better answers than that. Yeah, what would I really like to know? Kind of really like to know a lot of things, and I hope that thousands of people use it and discover interesting things and useful things and beautiful things. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer to that question.
No problem.
I should make one up. So
If you could collaborate with any scientist, living or dead, who would
Feynman
it
for
be and
sure,
why?
Richard
And
Feynman. Yeah. No, I mean I
I'm a
love
big
his
fan as well.
personality. What's that?
I'm a big fan as well.
Yeah.
But my undergrad was in physics, and I remember watching a lot of his like lessons and reading his books.
Yeah. No, I love his personality. I love his sense of humor. I love his penetrating. But also, like, there are other people who are penetrating, but he's also so flexible and so mobile, so polyhedric. He's a drummer, and he would do 12 against 13 rhythms. I mean, I could do 4 against 5, but 12 against 13, man.
Yeah, another Renaissance man.
Yeah,
And I think in today's world of AI, I can't help but noticing that there are many, let's say, computer scientists and engineering, let's say people from engineering department or well some linguistics as well, but most of people spend most of their lives in some computational science, and maybe they achieved some success and suddenly start feeling like an expert in philosophy and start writing some funny philosophical statements here and there. um, I've seen a lot of that, and I like approaches from people who come from very different walks of life and different disciplines. They went through the depth of different fields because that's really enriching. And if you, in the vast breadth of experiences that you had, what would you point out as misconceptions people have today about AI in general for the general public and specifically in AI within scientific?
that was a lot. Yeah, I guess I would. There's a lot to be gained by going deeply and
Yes.
studying something difficult far enough to become competent in it. There's so much to be gained in that. And one of the things that it does is give you a sense of pride in your powers, the powers of your mind. And that's a very good thing. And it's also a powerful temptation to think that the powers of your mind can resolve other problems too, that perhaps you aren't equipped to solve. For me, it's also been helpful to have experiences in completely different domains, like art, like painting, like music, like playing the violin. Because physical competence also teaches you a certain humility. You literally can't play the violin for more than a couple hours a day. I mean, you can push it, you can do like 5, but you're going to hurt yourself after a while, unless you have absolutely perfect form, which very few people do, and unless your body is made in a certain way, and you can't really change the way your body is made. So there's the experience of physical limits is also really helpful to learn what I guess is sort of just a lightheartedness that you can't resolve all the problems. Like the beauty of human intelligence is magnificent. It moves me to think of the beauty. Sometimes I'm moved to tears by the beauty of math. The beauty of a discovery. I had a problem recently that I had to solve. How do you compute a lot of nearest neighbors in a short amount of time? And when I discovered the KD tree algorithm, I was like, this is so beautiful. Just by recasting the problem in a different way, all of a sudden it's computationally totally tractable. You can do it, in a fraction of a second. It's great. Whereas if you do it sort of like a bull straight ahead, measuring every distance, you're never going to get done. That kind of thing is really beautiful. And at the same time, that learning how to handle the fact that there are some limits too, I think is really important. So to answer your question about, if you think that you've created a god, if you think that AI is like a personality, and it can certainly fool you to think that way because it's so good at mimicking human speech, and we are so easily fooled. We're so gullible as, just the way that we're built. That can lead you down some stupid paths, paths of, conclusions that aren't justified and are dangerous and damaging to yourself and to others. And then what was the part about science, the last part of your question?
Yeah, any misconception of the use of AI into science,
Yeah.
scientific discovery.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about the problem of going out of distribution, that the interesting things are the things that haven't been done before. And by definition, those are the things that the model doesn't know about. So, that's something that's important to remember. One of the talks that I gave last year at Oxford University, and I'm going to give again soon in Slovenia, is about human creativity and AI. And one of the things I use to try to show the difference is the movement from billions or trillions of words or tokens down to a summary, which an LLM can do, and the human movement from a very banal musical theme, like the theme that Diabelli sent out to a bunch of composers for the Diabelli variations, and then the seemingly infinite variety of responses to that prompt. I think it's worth thinking about, and to not have the misconception that science is different, because I think science is totally the same. That the really interesting things in science are the things that you didn't see coming. Some of them, like, Kepler and Copernicus, have to do with observation, just being so precise in your observations that you see a difference that nobody had noticed before. A lot of them have to do with thinking in a way that Einstein, thinking about the speed of light and what would happen if you were riding on the light beam, that kind of thing. It's highly creative, and that doesn't come out of just doing the thing that had been done before or staying within distribution. So, yeah, I mean, there's so much else to say there. But anyway.
Beautiful, beautiful. It was amazing. I think it's a fantastic concluding thought. Let's say hymn to the beauty of human intelligence. So thank you very much. It was a wonderful conversation, and
Thanks for having me.
I'll surely share all the links about the tool that you built.
All right. Well,
It
thank you,
was an
Alberto.
honor. Thank you, John.
And thank you for speaking honestly about AI. I really appreciate your headline there.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Bye.